My name is Ann Palmer. I'm with the Siberian Husky Club of America, and I'm the chair of the Breeder Exhibitor Fancier Education. And we are here today, myself and
Mary Gross.
Megan Torella.
and we are going to be interviewing today our legacy icon breeder, Michael Jennings. Michael Jennings has been in the breed since 1970 and has produced over 60 champions. He's written 3 books on the breed. He also has run his dogs in sprint, mid distance, and long distance. Mike is a AKC judge and has judged all over the world, including the Siberian Husky Club of America National Specialty. Mike, do you want to add anything or?
No, I think that's plenty.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So we're kind of going to do like a roundtable approach between Mary and Megan and
Cool.
I asking questions. So that way it's kind of conversational. All right. So I might as well start out with the first, and that is when and how did you acquire your first Siberian Husky?
I was in prep school my senior year. My dorm master had a Siberian Husky puppy, and I had had dogs, and I owned the fastest racehorse in South Iran and was the jockey um, before I came back to the States to high school. And I thought this Siberian Husky puppy was just the most magical puppy I ever saw. And my first wife, who was Scottish, had been my nurse when I had a motorcycle accident in France. And I came home we had an apartment in sort of the slums of Philadelphia, and I came home at like 2 in the morning, and there was this little black puppy that had mange, and I took him in and got him cleaned up, and I took him around the neighborhood. Um, no one claimed him. I was at the corner bar that used to get shot up on Friday nights, and I was ordering a sandwich, and a guy we called Crazy Charlie, I think, had just gotten out of prison for killing a man with his fists, and he walked in and he had, muscles like watermelon, and he said, "You got my dog." So
Perfect.
the bartender, the woman behind the bar said, "Charlie, he's been asking about the dog." So I gave him the dog, and I called up my wife who was at work and said, "The puppy's gone. Do you want another dog?" And she said, "Yes." So that day I went across into New Jersey and bought my first Siberian in a kind of pet kennel. He came from a Midwestern puppy mill, um, and had some Baltic in him, and he was really quite a wonderful. Wasn't a show dog, but um, uh, he was the only Siberian I had that I don't think was ever out of coat. So that was my pet, and I came to Syracuse as a grad student, and my father stopped in. He was still working overseas, and he said, "I'm surprised you're not breeding these," and that sort of gave me permission. So I called around and I went to a lot of kennels, but I finally found my way to Alakazam Kennels and Peggy Kohler, um, and that's how I bought my first breedable bitch, Alakazam's Soroya. And from her came my first champion, and she was one of really 4 foundation bitches that I used. She was line bred on Pando. I also got um, a daughter of Lorna's Aquila, um, line bred on Roadmaster, and I also got a Sinar daughter. I had seen Sinar in 1975, And I told Kathleen, if you ever breed um, that boy to that cute gray bitch that you have, whose name was Sarah, um, I want a puppy. And 2 years later, she called me and said, we've done it. So that was Innisfree's um, Sahar of Demavand. And then I also had a, a daughter of Red Son of Kiska. And I blended those over a long period of time um, to sort of establish my line. And I got to a certain point, uh, 3 or 4, 5 generations down, when I did some inbreeding. My I had this brother and sister. His name was Kiev, and her name was Basra. They both did significant winning, and so I began crisscrossing them, and that was when I felt I had the type and athleticism that I was looking for. Um, and after that, it was just figuring out how to maintain health, type, athleticism, temperament, etc. Mostly by going in and then out and in and out.
What aspects of the breed did you feel were most important to maintain when you were doing those in and out breedings?
Well, I was learning as I went. It took me quite a long time to figure out what to look for. You know, when you start, you see heads and faces. And unfortunately, the early breeders, Lorna and Peggy Kohler, they tended to reach down into the whelping box and keep the cutest face. So it took me a while to realize that really wasn't the best approach. But over time, when I began, I thought Panda was the ideal dog. And that was probably in large part why I was invited to write the book with Lorna, because Lorna did not write. But the irony is, as soon as, there were no photographs around in those days. Now we take it for granted you can see, but there simply weren't. And I told Lorna, when I saw the old pictures, I said, this book is worth a fortune just on the basis of the photographs. But what I realized as I began to look through the history, I realized that Panda was already a bit dumpy. He was lower on leg and heavier boned. And even though I never really came to know Short Sealy, because Peggy Kohler kind of warned me off her, Short could be pretty difficult. And by the time I came around, she was a little loony. But the irony was, once I started deciding what I wanted, I ended up with dogs more like Short's dogs than Lorna's dogs, more like Baldy, for instance, who Charlie Belford always felt that was Short's best dog. A little more leg, a little less substance than Pando. And eventually I wanted to produce a dog, I used to say, that could have looked at home on a stakeout chain in 1930, 40, or 50, maybe a little prettier, but basically that type of dog with a very medium body and significant leg. And over time, when I wrote the book, I sort of went to school with Rachel Page Elliott, and she told me a lot. I also talked to Seppala's first partner, Elizabeth Ricker, who told me that you can't judge a Siberian at a trot. They have to lope. That's what they do. And when she judged in Canada, she made all the handlers lope their dogs.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
and and, and a lot of the old timers were like that. Charlie, he wanted to see them lope to assess them. But eventually, I came up with what came to be my ideal, which is largely from Seppel, who said, let the scapula, humerus, pelvis, and femur be approximately equal length, which in his case was a hand span, which was about 7.5 inches, and let the tibia or let the radius ulna be about 20% longer, and the tibia fibula about 30% longer. Um, and and Cephalus said, if you've got 3 fingers between the shoulder blades and 4 fingers to a palm's breadth between the front, you have enough chest. You don't need to check any further for that. And then I like the leg length to be 20 to 25% longer than the depth of body. And for the length from point of shoulder to the point of pelvis to be about 10% longer than the height of the dog. So that's about 2.5 inches. And basically, that's what I look for, along with good muscling, good feet, and the proper angles. I think the problem with a great number of show dogs is they're straight in front and way overangulated in the rear. Um, and if you keep that, what Seppala's measurements told me is that you want that second thigh to be noticeably longer than the upper thigh, which means we say we want the stifle well let down. I think it should say moderately well let down. And if you look at almost any of the early dogs, be it Togo or Fritz or whatever, they are very moderately angulated. So that's sort of what I came to look for over a long period of time of teaching myself and having other people teach me.
So I know we just redid our standard, and you basically stated what some things you feel your specifics for. But so do you think there's items in the standard currently that might be stated more clearly?
I think I've always thought we should say leg from elbow to ground noticeably longer. I don't think slightly longer could be 1/4 inch, and that ain't right. So I've always argued with that slightly. And I think saying the stifle moderately well let down is also good. I also think we make too much of the low set hock joint. Low set hock gives you endurance, but if it gets too low, you don't have any speed. So I think the rear hock joint, the rear pastern, should be about 1/3 of the height of the pelvis. I had George Cook do some measurements many years ago when I was trying to work these things out, and he discovered the one thing that I think is maybe sex related, which is with the bitches, it's about 1/3, but with the males, it's slightly more than 1/3, the height at the rear pastern.
So this kind of gives us going into a new topic. So what do you look for in a given breeding when you're evaluating the dogs?
Well, I have theories. I read books on genetics when I first started, and I concluded that breeding had to be more an art than a science, because if you could have 100 puppies, you could do it by science. But when you're getting a sampling of six, you're shooting in the dark.
Right.
But I decided that elements of type are generally recessive and elements of soundness are generally dominant. So one thing I try to do is always breed dogs with as similar bone lengths as possible. That way you don't end up with offspring that look like they were put together by committee. So I've always made an effort to approximate the bone lengths that I've talked about. And if I need to reinforce type, for instance, I may go in a bit. But I think if you're always breeding to structurally sound animals, if you can put together dogs of similar bone length, you have consistent litters and athletic litters.
How do you feel about like line breeding versus inbreeding versus outcrossing and that consistency that you're talking about?
Well, I always did a lot of diagonal breeding. The old adage of let the sire of the sire be the grandsire of the dam on the dam side, or vice versa. Mostly it's just diagonal. It's how racehorses were bred. It's how they bred minks for coats. And Charlie Belfort thought he was telling me a great secret when he explained it to me, and I showed him my pedigrees, and he said, "Oh, you've been doing this for years." So yeah, now we have the new wrinkle of the whatever they're calling the quotient of whatever, and I don't really know that much about it. I don't really understand genetics enough. I suspect it's a good new technology to use, but I also suspect it's not a panacea. It's one of those things you want to also consider after you've looked at everything else. My worry is that people think just outcrossing to outcross to outcross is a good thing. Well, you will end up with mutts if you do that. A purebred dog has a degree of inbreeding to become a purebred.
Right.
So I hope that answers the question, that I do consistent inbreedings or diagonal breedings, and then anytime I can find a typey, serious sled dog, I will breed to that. And I will breed to that knowing I may not get a show dog for 2 generations. They may come out a little knobby at the knees or whatever, but to me, it's money in the bank. If you can, if you're breeding to dogs that for generations have been bred to work and compete, I assume that helps you. Of course, there's always the risk that you bring in something you don't want. So I try to know as much about the relatives as I can find out.
Is that the art of breeding that you're talking about?
Yeah.
Just knowing how to balance pedigree and anecdotal information and make the best decisions. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
And then you almost brought up one of our next questions is, do you consider phenotype or genotype first? And how do you balance that?
Absolutely, phenotype. The genotype is good. What I think the first rule to breeding is see it in terms of families, not individuals. I think there's way too much breeding to this year's top winner. I think that's bullshit. You've got to you've got to understand the families and what they tend to do. And then you have an individual who's going to produce something that may or may not be in line with what his family tended to do. I was trying to get a Roadmaster head for years, but my Roadmaster offspring weren't really giving me Roadmaster heads. You know that. So you have to adjust according to your dogs. And I occasionally tell people that my entire breeding intelligence is in the dogs. You know that I trust them to produce the kind of animal that I've been looking for, and I just try to help them do it, help them maintain health and vigor through sufficient numbers of outcrosses to keep them long-lived, vigorous, strong, and all those other things that working dogs have to have. They have to be able to drink enough. They have to poop on the run. They have to, eat enough. I can remember Al Stead telling me he had this wonderful sled dog, just the best he'd ever had, but he'd have to wait to next generation to get a better drinker, that he didn't drink enough. And all those things matter. I want when I first sold dogs to my friends in Europe who were racing them, they discovered two things about my dogs compared to what they had. Their webbing was much more extensive and their tongues were longer, both of which helps a sled dog. The webbing gets you over the snowbanks and the tongue releases heat. So I was very surprised to have someone point that out, but I was happy to know it.
Yeah, that's interesting. So this kind of leads into, so then how do you determine your pick of your keeper puppies? How do you go about that?
I cheat as much as possible. Meaning I sell from the bottom up.
Okay.
Whatever I deem a pet, I try to get out the door by the time they're 8 weeks or at 8 to 10 weeks, because that's when they're cute and pet people want them. For my keepers, I try to keep them as long as possible. And I have certain things that I look for as I appraise a puppy, but I bring them in. I watch them all the time. And I appraise their structure. I bring them in individually to compare them one-on-one. And, so I check out the fronts, the rears, the temperament. And then I pay a special attention to the one that just catches my attention most of the time. And I try to determine if that's something not right about the dog or if it's something very right about the dog.
Yeah.
But I find that the dog that holds himself or herself the best, I don't think this is anything important. No, this is Colorado. I don't know what it. So, the first thing I tend to do is I pick up puppies and I want to see that chest narrowing into my hand. That I don't want a round rib cage. I want a rib cage that tapers in, and I feel them right up at the neck. I want to feel that strong neck, and that tends to tell you about the shoulders, because the shoulders are so tiny. It's kind of hard, but I find if I hold them up and I check out the length, I don't want a particularly long neck, but I want a strongly arched neck. And I think that often indicates Um, good shoulders. Also, if you feel the last rib, the rib that comes back the furthest tends also to reflect the shoulder, because the rib cage is like an accordion, and you want it as fanned out as you can get it. So if that last rib goes back further, it's because the shoulder is also laid back better. And I'm looking ultimately for about a 30 to 35-degree shoulder layback. Maybe 35 is ideal. Um, and a I want a 35-degree angle of shoulder to the horizontal, to the vertical, and about a 30-degree angle to the croup on the horizontal. And that 30-degree angle of a croup is actually probably a 35-degree angle of the actual pelvis. And the rest is movement, type, and temperament. I try to get good snowshoe feet because I think that's something that we often overlook in the show ring, but I think it makes a huge difference going over snow. If you look at Sepulve's early dogs, they're real snowshoe feet.
Right.
When you keep those puppies, when do you begin training them, like for showing?
That changes over the years. At about 8 weeks old, I trail them around my living room chasing food. And then I take them outside. I actually always used a flexi so they can be as far from me as they want to be. And we just go up and down, and then I rein them in a little closer and a little closer. And, so I've started as early as 8-10 weeks. Yeah, I think that's how I've done it. It's been quite a while since I trained my own puppies, and it's one of those things you kind of forget stuff in a hurry. In this, I don't think I could actually manage the kennel I used to have, but now I only keep 2 or 3, so they're glorified house dogs.
So kind of following up on how you pick the puppies and train them. So what's the difference between a good Siberian and a great Siberian? And this probably leads into judging and your thoughts on judging, but also on which dogs you keep, right?
In terms of show ring reputation, $100,000 will make you make a good Siberian into a great Siberian, which is why I don't pay any attention to that shit, defining a great. Earl Norris was once asked how often there's a great Siberian. He said, "Oh, 1 in every 400." Well, okay. I've never had 400, so I suppose a great Siberian is sort of one that has it all, that has the structure, the type, and the temperament to do it. Whether it's running or showing, Sinar was a huge winner. By today's standards, he really wasn't all that good. He was flat and croup. He slipped. He was overangulated in the rear. He rolled in the top. But I said to Kathleen once after watching him, this dog would win with 3 legs because he had the temperament of a standard poodle. Sinar never stopped showing. I can remember seeing him in a circle of dogs outside the ring, three of the other dogs were best in show winners. And Tommy, I think, was talking. All the other dogs are kind of slouching. Sinner never took his eyes off. Sinner was showing the whole time. Da-da, da-da. And that, it's tough to beat that temperament. So maybe Sinner was a great dog, at least for his day. I mean, things have changed. I do think, I mean, I hear a lot of complaints about today's Siberians, and I don't go to a lot of dog shows. I do have the impression that there's still a lot of the foo-foo little dumpy dogs that trip around the ring on many. But when I go to specialties, I'm pleased to see the amount of leg and the cleanness of movement. In my day, you did not see perfect coming and going. I mean, I remember Miss Kitty Russell. She was a little funky in the rear. Pando was loosey-goosey in the rear. Sonny was a little too close in the rear. So I think the best of our Siberians are very clean coming and going by comparison to the past. I think most of them are a little more dog than I would really want to hook up. They're a little burlier, they're a little heavier boned. I don't want that much dog because I don't think they'll go 100 miles. And I don't think they'll hit 20 miles or better for short distances. I think a lot are probably 14-mile-an-hour dogs. Did I answer the question? Did I?
Right. So that, but you did kind of go into, so what do you see as the common faults in the show ring today?
Straight shoulders, over-angulated rears.
Okay.
And short legs, short upper arms, short pelvises, often flat pelvises, and overly long femurs to give them that bent knee kind of sprint look.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
When you have new people coming into the breed, aside from like mentorship, what advice would you give them to kind of not fall into those pitfalls of finding those dogs with the obvious faults? Because a lot of times those are the ones that are the cutest and most sellable ones that people tend to start out with.
Right.
Yeah.
Good question.
Well, I like something that Brenda Valletta once said. The word pretty is not in the standard. I like pretty dogs, but I can certainly see dogs that are typey that aren't necessarily pretty. And to me, the essence of type is really in the proportions. It took me a long time to draw that conclusion. I thought type was about head, but really, if you look at sled dogs in Alaska prior to the introduction of Siberians, the best ones have the proportions that we like in a Siberian. Just a little off square, and so on. So I think the system of mentorship has a lot to be recommended. When I started, you couldn't learn anything but sitting at other people's knees, the older breeders. We knew all our pedigrees in our heads. And nowadays, it's awfully easy to push a button, get a pedigree, and think you know it. Just because you own it on paper doesn't mean you know it. So I think mentors help usher people into the game. And then I never said a word at ringside for the first 7 years I was in the breed. I just listened because I was trying to figure out, who can you believe? You know, how do you separate the wheat from the chaff? And, you know, so I sat at Peggy Kohler's feet. Then I sat at Lorna's feet. And then I sat at Kathleen's feet. But eventually I found my way to Charlie Belford, who gave me the keys to the kingdom because he understood them from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And people like um, Dick Moulton, who, was Bird's handler in the Antarctic, who I think won a Congressional Medal of Honor, both for saving Admiral Byrd in the Antarctic and for rescuing soldiers in the Battle of the Bulge. And he knew a ton. He was the one, when they were writing the SEP standard, he was the one who insisted that they write showing great strength when pulling. The others would have dropped it, but he believed in the power of the Siberian, despite being a small dog. In fact, he told me a wonderful story. When he got to the Antarctic, Bird went away, and he had brought. It was the second trip, and he had Sealy Siberians, and Bird called him and said, "How come Milton Sealy sent me all these little dogs?" And Moulton said, "I don't know. You'd have to ask Milton." Bird went away on a trip, came back in 4 or 5 days, called Ford Moulton again, and he said, "I have to apologize. The men told me how hard these dogs worked unloading the ship." And after telling that story, Moulton said, "I knew that not only do big dogs get tired quicker, but they also need more time to rest." But I wasn't going to tell him that. So, yeah, he believed in their strength as working dogs, and the people that I work with in Europe believe in that too, because they used to race through the Alps, 250-mile races, and they took like third and fourth, and that's against all the teams in Europe. I mean, that's a pretty, not just Siberian teams. So if you've got mountains or whatever, you need some power on the team as well as the speed. Charlie used to say he didn't expect a dog to pull any more than pulling on his sleeve like this. Charlie used to train at about, I think, 11 to 16 pounds per dog, but in racing he wanted it down to 9.9 pounds per dog. So that's a little far afield from where we started the question, I think, but you get
that's fine.
Yes, this is good. Yes.
Covered your mentors, and so this is kind of following up with the newer people. What are your thoughts on co-ownerships?
You can't own the same half. That's what I noticed early on. That's what ruins co-ownerships. People ended up wanting to own the same half, and then they fight. With me, co-ownership has only been my interest in the genetics. They can have the dog, they can treat it like their own. I just want breeding access. And I've had very good luck with all but one co-ownership doing it that way. But I do think they're tricky when suddenly the dog becomes a big winner and everyone wants a piece of him. Or conversely, the dog comes up with something wrong and no one wants to touch him.
So then what's your ideal Siberian Husky home?
My ideal Siberian Husky?
Home.
Co-owner?
No, owner in general, probably, if you're looking for a pet owner or a show owner or running
a new show home versus an older show home, yeah.
In terms of who I want to breed my dogs, which is the same for me as a show home generally, I want them to understand there's a spiritual dimension. They're not commodities. And if you can't rise to that spiritual sense of the nobility and history and just magic of the breed, then I don't want to sell you a dog. They're not commodities, and I've always sold to people who are realistic middle class people. I don't sell to rich people generally because rich people expect their money to do everything. And I just don't believe in it. When there was the big sales to the Japanese and all that, I wanted no part of that. It. I think it demeans the dogs. So I want there to be love, basically,
Right.
but also realism. There are people that I consider real dog people, and there are tourists in the game. And I'm interested in the real dog people who know it's at least a 20-year proposition, um, and that disappointments always outweigh the successes. It's just a law of the game. Um, but if you see it as a spiritual, if you have the ability to love every dog for who and what he or she is, and still have a sense of moving toward an ideal. If you don't get, in other words, if you can love the animals but not get kennel blind, I think that's the balance that I look for. Um, and For the most part, I sell pets because I don't like to get the calls about little Twinkie's rear isn't looking too good today, and he's 5 months old, and you know, um, yeah.
Yeah, we get that. So this is really great. So, why do you do it? Like, what is your breeding philosophy? It just you kind of went right into that.
I just love the breed, and there was a very prominent breeder when I was young who was increasingly breeding Siberians of a sort I didn't believe in. And that's why I decided if the breed was going fine, I wouldn't have taken on to be, but I thought it was going in bad directions. And I thought, I've got to do it myself. Um, and since then, I just, I love seeing them grow up and reproduce. I I had some wonderful dogs when I was growing up in Iran, and one in particular was kind of a magical cross. He was part shepherd and, you know, probably part Akbash, um, but he was very cute. He had one erect ear and one half erect, and he was super smart. And my dogs, they ran free, and we had big hedges, and I could call them, and they would come leaping through the hedges to come home. And I came home one night, they were both lying in my front yard, poisoned. And I think that's why I became a dog breeder, so that I would always have them. um, so keeping the best of their forebears is part of why I stay in the game. I love to see how they repeat. Um, I have some of mine who always cross their legs when they lie down. Some of mine who don't.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and it's, my grandmother came from a family that was much older than mine, and I didn't know her brothers. But I remember when I was 16 or 17, standing in a yard, and she said, my older brother always stands that way. And so it works sort of the same in humans, how certain physical characteristics and you see that in the dogs, you see that in their personalities. Um, and yet each one is an individual in their own right. They always bring something a little bit unique to the game. And I like when I used to train dogs, train them, I liked figuring out what worked for them because no two are quite the same. Their triggers are a little different. So I like
Makes
having
sense.
access to the breed. I won't be around that much longer, but I'm still bringing back a youngster from my my partners in Europe that will eventually become my son's dog because I'm trusting the pup will outlive me, but you never know. um, I never thought actually I'd live as long as I have so far. So every day is a surprise. Does that answer that why I do it?
Yes, it did. Yep.
So this the young puppy that you're going to be bringing over, will you be showing it or will it be a companion?
No, it'll probably um, Dominic Ferretti will show him. He's bringing over a couple of girls I'll co-own, and we'll keep the boy here for however long. If my son chooses to show, um, he will show it. He's very good with dogs, but he's never shown them. Um, and I'm not sure his ego will take the subordination to learn how to do it. He doesn't really like people to tell him how to do stuff. And, I've said on the one hand, showing's very easy once you get the knack, but some people never get the knack. Um, and it's more complicated than it looks. Um, so he will socialize the pup. He's very good at that. You'll probably take him to the park. But whether we get into him actually going to a handling class or whatever, I've told him if you want to show, we've got to find a handling class because you can't just make it up. So we'll see how that plays. But we definitely intend to show. He'll be probably the last Demavand stud dog. Um, so you know,
Do you enjoy showing them as puppies or do you like to wait and let them mature before you show them?
when I did it a lot, I would show them 4 or 5 times from 6 months to 9 months, just so they had the idea. And then once they knew how to do it, I would put them away till they were 2 years old, usually for bitches, and 3 years old for dogs. I mean, I'd show them before, but I never expected, Marley Tuck's Red Son of Kiska was shown throughout his early years without ever taking a point till he was 3 years old. And then he finished in 2 weekends. And that sort of taught me. With my first champion, I showed them as a puppy. I took first points at like 11 months old and so on. But then he hit 2 years old and he finished bing, bing, bing. And I thought, oh, That's how you do this. You wait till they're actually competitive and then you
Right.
show them. So by and large, because I never had two nickels to rub together, that's the way I did it. Um, Wait till they actually were competitive, or at least admit to myself that I'm going along to train the puppy. You know,
So then when you're looking for to take your puppy out or for to show, what do you look for in the judge you're showing under?
breeder judge.
That's easy.
But what do you look for in that judge?
I want a breeder judge who knows what a working Siberian looks like. There are a lot of so-called breeder judges who don't know that, and I don't. But I always felt if I could win under both Jean Fournier and Phyllis Brayton, I had a pretty good dog because Jean was all about type and Phyllis was all about proportions. Um, Now they're not that many of that kind of breeder judge around, but I've never much liked all rounders. I I think it's a lie. I don't think anybody knows more than 10 breeds well. They're faking it. And I've sat at tables with them and I know they're faking. So I like breeder judges who have some experience with a working Siberian because they'll look at all the colors, they know what movement to look for, and they know what priorities of movement correlate to a working dog. Like the first thing I'll uh, forgive in a Siberian is a close rear because I know functionally close rear doesn't hurt them much, but a wide rear or a wide front that really hurts them. So judges who have made some of those decisions on priorities. Um, so that's pretty much what I look for. But I never studied judges enough. I never, so that I would take potluck. And there are a lot of shows I went to with an open bitch and watched the puppy dog class and know I should have stayed home. You know, you say, oops, this was the wrong guy, you know.
Right.
He wants little hairy things or
So
whatever.
you turn that around and say, when you're in the judge's shoes, what do you look for?
Yeah, it's like some breeds, as you know, in their standard, they even call for percentages of priorities when judging. So for you, if you were just to say you're 1, 2, 3, what are you looking for?
Height to length proportions, good front, not overangulated rear, and a decent croup, and then movement. You know, I like type too, but that's sort of I like to see them there in silhouette. And I want the proportions, the croup, the shoulders, and then coming and going movement, around movement, and decent head type. Um, it doesn't have to be exquisite head type, but you know, I want well-furred ears with slightly rounded tips. I want a gentle taper. I want almond-shaped eyes. I don't want round eyes. I want a nice kind of soft stop. You know, I don't want a big brow. Um, and you know, a good double coat that's not been trimmed.
When you see judges coming into our breed when they get them, what do you think they struggle with the most?
Well, I used to think they struggled most with the variations of look that comes with different colors. But now everything's gray and white. So we're almost like the Doberman ring now. You know, it's all the same dog with variations. Um, and to me, that's hugely ironic because when I started showing, there were only two gray dogs that you would see in New England. They were both Sunny kids. One was Aki of Husky Wort, and one was a dog named Micah. And I decided, oh, I think I'd like to breed some gray dogs. And Tommy apparently saw the same thing. And overnight, everything became gray. Um, so I'm always happy now if I see colors other than gray, even though I keep grays because I find in my experience with the genes the grays had the most kind of weatherproof coats. They were like rubberized things. The black dogs would sunburn. The red dogs could really sunburn. Um, so I like all the colors, but I think the gray is the easiest to manage. I've never had a gray that got a dried out coat or anything. Um, I think I I had a friend that I taught about Siberians who was a Great Dane, not a Great Dane, a Saint Bernard breeder, and she struggled, and I suspect many with the fact that coming and going, Siberians are terribly sound. You know, she said, half of our dogs are cripples, and I go into your ring and they all move, you know. So I think that may be part of the struggle. But I think they misconceive what a working Siberian does. They look for power. And I think the last thing you should notice about the Siberian is power. I think the Siberian power is a wiry strength. It's subtle. So you're not looking for pulling power. As Charlie said, you're not looking for pulling power on the sled. You're looking for rolling power. Um, so I think the movement is sound enough that it gives them problems. And I think they look for a chestier, stronger looking dog than I want, because those dogs aren't usually very good sled dogs. You know, Siberians are wiry. They don't have any hound in them. So they're not powerful muscled. I mean, I have very hard dogs, but they don't have any of that hound kind of thick muscling. They're wiry, um, lean, distant runners. You know, I don't want them to look like Alaskans. I think you have to find that happy medium. But I suspect, and maybe the difference in colors when there are difference in colors maybe throws them. But I like the fact that dark dogs get a look. I can remember time when, you know, dirty faced dogs of the color that Judy Russell used to call shit brown never got a look at all, you know. Whereas I like those dogs, you know. I think they're indigenous, they're primitive, they're what most of the early dogs look like. Um, and I think the pigment that goes with those, um, good pigment. So that's my hunch at what throws. But you know, you probably, Megan, have a much better idea than I because you're out there all the time.
I get a lot of judges that say that I think it's such an easy breed because they're sound and you just look for the cleanest moving and the nicest, profile going around. And they said that they just struggle because they walk in and it's apples, grapes, and oranges. And it's
Really?
I guess maybe that goes with color, like you're describing, and maybe the coat texture, how that changes maybe the outline of the dog um, on the stack. But yeah, I always get that comment to me from new judges, and I always thought it was so weird because I think it's so easy.
Yeah, well, I think that the first thing that they have to learn, and we certainly proselytize this in judges education, you got to be colorblind.
Right.
You can't see the color. You got to see the outline. You got to see the proportions. You have to see the kind of coat, um, but you can't be distracted by color or markings. And I think I can remember when judges couldn't find a white dog for years. They just couldn't see a white dog because they didn't look typey to them because they were used to the facial markings. Um, but now white dogs do okay, I think.
What do you feel is your greatest accomplishment as a breeder?
Coming up with a family that breeds true. You know, people tell me they can tell one of my dogs anywhere in the world. Um, and, I'm proud of that. I don't think they're eccentric, but they're recognizable. And I think that I bred them in such a way that they will tend to reproduce themselves. That kind of what you see is what you get. I know
So,
Dominic was just at my partners that have, probably 30, 35 sled dog Siberians. And he said they're all the same dog. You know, they're so consistent in temperament, in movement, and so on. He couldn't believe they all moved as they move, but they've been bred for a similar bone length for a long time.
if you could
Some
do
are slightly, yeah.
something differently, would you do anything differently now?
Well, it would be nice if I had come to the conclusions that I came to after 20 years, if I had come to them sooner. But, the learning process was also fun. Um, I don't think there's anything in retrospect. I, I wish I had known more earlier. But apart from that, what ended up as the results, I'm happy with. Um, I was lucky in the co-ownerships that I had, because when I started this, Siberian was quite erratic. Um, Fortunately, I had a partner in Pete Perez who kept 65 Siberians. So I could kind of pick and choose and say, let's breed these two, and gradually got the type I wanted, and then gradually got the structure I wanted. Um, I could not have kept that many dogs, so that gave me, you know, certain benefits in creating a, you know, I was so disappointed to realize that Pando was not the be all and end all, that I was a little bit at a loss. I needed some kind of model. And I discovered Krivanka and Fritz and decided anything between Krivanka and Fritz was what I wanted. Um, and there was a time when we had these great big heads in the ring. And I remember seeing Millie Turner's team, that you may know the photograph, where she's there with, I can't remember what the Zerko son was, but there were these light colored dogs with almost feminine heads. And I thought, I bet I could. What I realized is that everything is related, that you can't have a graceful athletic body with a great big fat head on the front, that you know what you see in the head you will see in the body. The head does anticipate. So I wanted a somewhat more refined style of head to get a somewhat more refined style of dog. Um, and we inched toward that until we got um, a couple of gray dogs that then produced, it took many generations, but
Yeah.
eventually, and I guess that's what I'm proudest of is that I imagined it and then I created it.
Right.
That I had to imagine it first because it was they were pretty squatty when I started. They Panda was the ideal. They were, and when you got dogs like Copper Bullet, who had legs like 2x4s and a head like a pumpkin, um, that was a disaster as far as I was concerned. Um, they were just
Yeah, yeah.
way too coarse. Um, so, I was an athlete. I was recruited to college for racket sports, so I kind of knew what it took to get an athletic dog. Um,
Right.
and I had raced horses, so I
So
had
you did mention Pete Perez, and I know that Shunko was one of your favorite, as he was mine. So who was your best specimen, given all of that you
Anna.
feel like Anna?
Anna. I felt she was our most perfect Siberian. Probably, I would have given her maybe a little more length of muzzle, but everything else I think with her was I think I just happened to have this was Anna.
Oh, oh yeah.
That's Virginia Beach, right? Or
Yeah.
I'm not
Oh
even
yeah.
sure where this was
Or wait,
because I
it
wasn't
was
there.
Virginia.
Joe showed
Dawn
me.
was there. Oh, that had to be no. That's Colorado.
Oh, Colorado.
Colorado. We were
Okay,
there. Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Um,
This is an award of merit. She was pretty old here. I mean,
mhm.
so she's looks a little softer, but she she moved perfectly. She also was a self-appointed lead dog. Um, she was over at Doug Mothercell's, and he said she insisted on being the leader. She went around the dog, and she chose her own trail. She the way real Siberians do. The
Mhm.
Chukchi. That's how they do it. They let the dogs choose their own trail because the dogs are smarter, um, and that's how the Chukchi do it. They don't over direct the dog. What a Chukchi does is he gets a bunch of dogs, heads off in a given direction, and then goes to sleep on the sled. And the
Mhm.
dogs find their way because they know when the ice is too thin. They can also scent where the blowholes are for the seals and so on. And so they get there, and the guy wakes up and goes seal hunting. Um, so that independence, uh, and they've Elizabeth has talked about that with one of the top Eurohounds guys who says, I envy your dogs because they know what to do. He says, my dogs will only do what I tell them to do. And Siberians have ability to be smarter than the driver. Um, and I like their temperament that I've written about that you can work, they will work with you, they won't work for you, you know. uh, and I have never really experienced as Elizabeth has. Elizabeth says if you're out in the wilderness with a big team, that it's totally magical. The dogs she doesn't even have to stake them out because when they hear wolves howling and things, they're not going to go anyplace. They
Mhm.
they stay close in, and they're really a team. And she says it's the most magical thing in the world, which is why she does it. I've never experienced that. I've experienced the whisper of the runners and all that stuff, but that really being out in the middle of nowhere and having the dogs really be part of your family, I'm sure is quite magical.
You have such a robust understanding of the history of our breed. What changes have you seen occur over the years within it? Good, bad.
Well, I think the peak of the dual purpose Siberian was in the 1950s because people only started showing in the summers when they couldn't drive their dogs. So everyone who was showing was also a dog driver. That's hard to beat. I don't know how absolutely sound they were. I suspect they were a little kinky if you probably a lot moved a little wide in the rear or whatever, but they were efficient at a lope. Um, so in the 60s, Pando kind of took over as a model. So we got a lot of black and white, blue eyed, somewhat shorter legged dogs. You know, Lorna only created Pando because she couldn't buy Isaac of Gap Mountain. Isaac of Gap Mountain was the dog she really wanted. He was black and white, blue eyed, and he figures in Pando and Roadmaster's background. And I only saw one picture of him with any clarity. I think he had more leg. I think he was a more athletic sled dog. I mean, Pando was quite a good leader, but he just wasn't that leggy. Um, so in the 60s, you had all the black and white. They had strong backs. Um, they didn't have a lot of sternum bone. They were fairly straight in the rear. They were pretty compact. They got a bit chesty. And then Kathleen came along and she sort of gave us the McDowell Lyons Siberian. I don't know if you've read McDowell Lyons, but if you read him, his ideal was sort of a German Shepherd. So Kathleen started stressing the sternum bone and the rear angulation. And you got these kind of, you know, Bo Tucker and these chesty, big prosternum. What I realized is that those dogs, you know, like Kathleen's with that prominent sternum bone, they look like they have a long upper arm because that sternum is way. But if you felt them, they're really short in the upper arm, which is why they couldn't run because they had big chests and short upper arms. They couldn't get around it. Harris Dunlop spent a whole day trying to explain that to Kathleen because I introduced the two of them. And we'd talk on the phone and he'd say, well, I explained it to her why her dogs couldn't run. And she seemed to understand. And then she'd come back the next day and say, but Harris, my dogs do run. So they were like oil and water. They just didn't fit. But so we went through the Innisfree Siberian, which got often a little softer in the top line, much more rear angulation. Most of them were kind of short. And I remember I was at Peggy Kohler's and I was thinking of buying a puppy. And Kathleen, you know, she was always the master of sales. She wanted to take over. And she put a puppy on the table and she said, well, you know, Peggy and I have pretty small dogs, so I always pay attention to the chest. And I realized she was picking her puppies on the size of chest. You know, they might be short legged, but she wanted them to have a lot of chest, which I think is dead wrong. You know, Charlie Belford said, if I can't see the elbows clearly below the chest, I won't even hook the dog up because I know he can't do it. So there was that change. And we still have the residue of those Innisfree dogs, which I think tend to be a little too much. But I think that judges' education and things has emphasized leg length sufficiently that at least in dog shows where I've attended, usually where there's a breeder judge, an awful lot of them have good leg. So I think we've done well in that. I think our dogs are definitely cleaner coming and going, and proportionately more leg than we had in the 70s and the 80s. I don't remember much after that, the 90s. But what I see, you know, uh, whether it's Anne does her cell phone and I get to watch some dogs at shows or whatever, it looks like I think we're pretty much in the right direction of what I see. Now, I say that to friends and they say, oh, you don't know, it's really terrible out there. And I understand that weekend to weekend, you do get these weekend warriors with what I call the foo-foo dogs with their short little muzzles and their cute little faces. But when I see specialties, at least, I think, you know, head type may not always be as consistent as that once was, but I think, you know, a dog like yours, Mary, you know, I admired that dog on video. Um, you know, that's the sort of dog that I want. Maybe with a little less rearangulation, but I love the croup and the movements very good. Um, you know, you all saw me judge whenever it was. I liked those dogs. I mean, I thought that all my winners had definite merit and were better than anything you could have found in 1970. You know,
So you've judged all over the world and you've just discussed what you've seen in America mostly through the ages. Do you see differences around the world?
well, it changes. When I first started judging in Italy, you could tell, you know, Italy's into design. So I had some of the most exotic heads and so on, and the shittiest rears you could imagine. Partly because they were all raised on Italian tile.
Oh,
So they moved around cowhocked to not slip.
Got it.
I don't recommend raising dogs on Italian tile. You know, it's not good for their rears. But they had no concept of movement. They didn't know how to, but that changed. They have some quite good Siberians in Italy. Marisa, what's her last name?
Dracol. I can't pronounce it right.
Right.
It's Italian.
Well,
yeah.
I almost always end up putting her dogs up, even when none of her family is showing them, because, you know, apart from being a little overangulated in the rear, in some cases, they strike me as the typiest and the best movement. Now, one of the dogs that I rewarded in the young dog class, I never get their classes straight. I always have to have a steward tell me, what am I pointing to next? But there was a young dog that caused quite a stir because I put him up and he carried his tail like this, you know, it was a little over the back, and everyone came up and said, isn't it our dog tail tight? I said, no. If I can see daylight under, it's fine. But they are so obsessed. And Tommy did this to us. Tommy was the one who let judges think that if they didn't trail their tails, it wasn't correct, um, which is bullshit. When I started, so Red Son of Kiska did not win a group because he wouldn't raise his tail, and judges faulted him for that. I had one of his daughter, and one judge faulted her and said, "Oh, she's a lazy bitch. She won't get her tail up." And then it was suddenly the opposite. If you didn't trail the tail, it was no good. And people even started, I mean, Harry Smith once called the bitch of mine having a gay tail. Gene straightened him out real quick, but that's what they thought. If the tail came up, it was wrong. Um, we made too big a deal of tails. If you look at any of Cephalus dogs, they all have the capacity to carry them tight sometimes.
Right.
The point is what they do when they're working.
And it's really more the set, right?
Right. It is the set that makes the difference.
That's what I try to send the message. It's not, as long as it's not crossing over, it's good. It's the set that's their issue. Yeah.
But when I started showing, everything had a fox brush tail carried in a sickle curve over the back. You almost didn't see a trailing tail, except Marley Tuck's Red Son of Kiska and some of the offspring. So it was interesting that they all had heart attacks because I was putting up this dog. But I said, it's fine. I'd like it a little looser, but I'm not going to fault it. And everything else about the dog is fine. I can remember I had this little cross race. I breed to race dogs occasionally, and I had this little offspring who would carry his tail tight sometimes. And I thought, who could we show him to that could get past the tail? You know, in the early days when they put points on, they only gave 5 points to the tail. But it's so easy to see the judges faulted. So I thought, who could get past it? And I thought, Vince Bonello. Let's take him to the National out west. And he had never been shown this dog. Johanna took him in. And Vince had him at the top of the open class. Sharon Oshro was going crazy. She was so offended because he didn't even have much coat. And she was going around ringside complaining. And well, the dog didn't know what he was doing, and he started barking eventually. And Vince dropped him down to third and brought Arcasio up to first. But he almost won that because as long as you kept him moving, his tail was, but he could put it a little tight. But Vincent could see beyond it and he wasn't troubled by it. Right. I showed the dog to Charlie, who adored him. He thought he was the greatest thing since sliced bread because he was built like a real running dog. I think I can't remember who the background was on the race dog that I used. I've reached that age where my memory gets a little fuzzy about dogs 30 years ago. But yeah, I think we overemphasized the tail, and Tommy made too big a deal out of it. I don't have trouble with a sickle tail carriage, even if it's, I don't care even if the tip touches the back a little. It doesn't seem important to me as long as there's a decent croup angle so that the tail set is where it should be.
So, Megan, do you have anything? Oh, we lost you, Megan.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Sorry, the kids were in here, so
no worries.
So you're talking about tails, and that's not really a huge consideration for you in terms. What is when you're picking a stud dog? What is your biggest primary consideration?
To complement the bitch. So if the bitch is a little upright in shoulder, I want to find a good shoulder. If she's a little close in the rear, I want to find a good rear. But mostly, I want to find a good match for her virtues. I want to complement her virtues and de emphasize whatever her shortcomings might be, or whatever shortcomings I know reside in the family. I've always been, I believe that in breeding dogs, you have to be willing to live with the gray because you cannot reduce everything to black and white. So I can live with shortcomings that do not hurt a pet. So if they have a little bite, I can live with that. I don't want undershot, but I can live with level if it has to be. If trying to think of what other, unilateral crypt orchids, I can live with occasional that as long as it's not habitual because it doesn't hurt them as a pet. They need to be neutered anyway, blah, blah, blah. So if I know these things are residing in the family, I try to counteract that. I don't want to breed to anything that has any history of level bites or any history within the last 3 generations, say, of unilateral crypt orchids. So I don't want to double up on what I may know resides in my immediate background. And beyond that, I want to find as near ideal a stud as I can find. Or if it's more of a race dog, I want to make sure that there's a reasonable amount of type. I used one of Judy Courier's leaders many years ago that was bred by the Johnsons. And that leader was on their Iditarod team and came in the 7th fastest time for the last leg of the Iditarod in history. Well, I thought that was impressive enough. And Gail Castonguay bought him because Judy Courier was going to Alaskans. And I saw him and I thought, I'm going to use this dog because I know he's done it. And he has pretty good type. And, it worked for us. We had to be careful how we handled it. And I didn't expect, there are some breedings that you do where you're just looking for one puppy. And if you're using a sled dog whose type may be a little fuzzy, you want to pick the typiest. If you're putting together 2 extremely typey dogs and you got a whole litter of type, then you want to try to find the best mover. So it depends on what you're doing the breeding for, what you're going to choose the puppy for, and the further I came in my breeding program, the more I tended to keep 2 puppies that I could crisscross. This was what I did with Kiev and Basra. Kiev had the best front I ever saw on a Siberian, but he was a little over-angulated in the rear. Basra had a perfect rear, but she didn't have quite the front that he did. But by crisscrossing, I shortened up his back and probably gave her a little more front. But Kiev's measurements, Charlie wanted 7.5 inches everywhere. We measured Kiev and he was 7.5 inches, 7.5 inches, 7.5 inches and 8 inches for the femur. And Charlie said, if you're only half inch on one bone length, that's pretty good. Uh, and an old timer saw him walking at a sled dog show. Um, what was his name? He was kind of a famous old timer, and he jumped up and ran over to Jack, who was walking him, and said, "That's a purebred, right? I haven't seen one like that for 30 years." So I felt what was yeah, there was Northome, but there was the guy that had Northome's Junior, Northome's Jonas, um, Joel Northome, I think was his name, but he had been around for a long time, and so that was sort of gratifying to have an old timer get that excited about him. I never
Right.
specialed him because I thought his rear was not quite what I wanted. But the one time he was taken out, he won the breed under Phyllis. So that was nice.
Mhm.
That's how we kind of started talking way back a billion years ago.
Right. Over Kiev.
Actually, Kiev was my first stud dog.
Yeah.
But it didn't work. But it was.
Yeah, it was a good try. Yeah.
A lot of work.
So I think on time now we'll maybe do a round robin and then we'll wrap it up. So I'm gonna and my last question would be, if you had the option, what would you do differently?
Mhm.
You did do that?
I asked that.
You took my question. Okay. All right.
Poor Michael.
We're moving. We're moving around.
Like
Well, what I said then was that I would learn faster. I
Oh,
would
okay.
start
That was
by
that.
knowing
Got it.
what
Yeah.
I knew at 20 years or whatever, because it
Yeah.
really did take me about 20 years to have a definite idea of what I
Okay.
wanted to do.
Yeah. I remember that. I didn't realize that was a question to that. Okay.
Actually, it's really hard because I think we've asked everything. We've asked pretty much everything, or you've answered them without being asked.
Right. We've
This
just
has
kind
been
of flowed really
amazing.
well. It's been great.
So-
Yeah. Megan, do you have anything else you'd like to ask?
Well, I could go on and on for hours, but I don't want to take
Right.
too much
I
of
know.
everyone's time. It's been a wonderful conversation. I guess, do you have any advice for the
Yeah.
future generation of Siberian breeders? I mean, there's definitely a new crop, and unfortunately, they didn't have the
Well,
the greats that.
my advice is listen to everyone, take it all with a grain of salt, figure out, but try to understand the families and what the families tend to do. Don't get carried away with stars. You know, I don't care how many ribbons or whatever the dogs won. He still might not be the right stud dog for you. And it takes so long to learn to see that I would advise going as slow as possible, because so many people want to jump in with both feet and they get 6 dogs, and 10 years later you've got 6 old dogs and no kennel room for the next promising dog. So always keep the kennel open for the next promising pup. Otherwise, you can't grow, and don't acquire too many at once. And don't make too many decisions based on your earliest years and your impressions, because what you're seeing when you're a beginner is not what you will see in 5 or 10 years if you're at all dedicated as a student of the breed. there's a whole lot of people who know everything they're going to know in a year because they're not going to learn anymore. And instead, they're going to study winning. They're going to study grooming. All that stuff's fine, but learn the breed.
Right.
I know a professional handler I see posting sometimes who I'm sure thinks he knows everything there is to know about the breed and every dog he handles is so over-angulated in the rear. I think it's laughable. And I'm sure he thinks he's a Siberian expert. So always cross the street to talk to sled dog people. Always cross the street to talk to any other breeder of any breed, except maybe toys, who knows something. Because what I found fascinating is that other breeds have different ways of naming things, and when you say, oh, like I remember Afghan people talking about what they've lost is they've developed a low back for that. Well, I never would have thought of describing a dog as having a low back, but I could see what they meant. And I had a theory that I was showing a dog for someone. When I was young, people handed me dogs to show all the time. And I was handed this really ugly dog down south, and I'm in the ring and I'm looking at this long head. And then I looked down at the upper arm and I thought, yeah, but look at how long that upper arm is. And I began to pay attention and I realized there tends to be a correlation between muzzle length and length of upper arm. And I hypothesized that to a girl who was showing Shelties. I said, I think that she said, oh, we know that in the breed. It's absolute. No, well, we don't know that in our breed. People look at me like I'm crazy when I say that, but the Sheltie people knew that. The other thing, for instance, I learned from the Sheltie people, I read an article once that said, remember that front assembly is composed of dominant genes, which is why it's so easy to lose good fronts. So you can learn things from other breeds and their way of thinking that you can bring back and sort of apply it to ours and learn from that. But I think it's always useful to, like we showed, what was Alstead was at a show and I wanted to show him Casio, and he loved his rear, he loved his feet, but he said, he's a little weak in back. Now he didn't have any, but it's because he hadn't been worked. But a sled dog person could spot that. I didn't spot it. So it's always good to get someone who really does the thing to have a look and give an opinion. Usually sled dog people cannot see a Siberian in full coat. They'll say, oh, he's fat, he's whatever. They'll come back when the dog's out of coat. Now that one I like. So if you want to show to a sled dog person, show them out of coat. They can see them that way. Otherwise,
I hope that works with me and Ann, because that dog's going to be out of coat.
Yeah. Well, Mike, it's actually been wonderful. This has been a great interview, and we really thank you very much for taking the time.
I hope it helps.
Absolutely.
I'm flattered you asked.
Thank you. All right.
All right. Stop the recording.